You can get Sons of Patriarchy completely ad-free on Apple Podcasts for $4.99 per month or $44.99 per year. This applies to our entire back catalog and every upcoming episode completely ad-free. Listening without interruption. If you don't mind the ads, you can still listen to the series for free on any of your favorite podcast platforms. This revenue helps support Outreach Idaho and helps pay the bills of the series. Now, on to the episode. Quick announcement before we start this episode. We've launched our website and initial line of merch. Go to sonsofpatriarchy.com and pick up a t-shirt, a sticker, or a crew neck fleece, or all three. And wait till you see our design. We went bold. A link to the website is in our show notes, or simply type sonsofpatriarchy.com into your search bar. Now, on with today's conversation. All right, so we got another fun expert on religion, politics, Christian Reconstructionism, and then also evangelical femininity and how all of this plays into our modern context. If you can introduce yourself, the institution you've been part of, and some of your research areas as well.
Hi, Peter. My name is Julie Ingersoll, and I am a professor of religious studies at the University of North Florida. Although this research actually spans about 30 years for me, probably. So I've been at a number of institutions over that period of time. My first book was on evangelical Christian women and war stories. That was women who were sort of caught. The book came out in 2003. It was actually my dissertation. And the women, there was a rise of interest in egalitarianism and having women leaders in evangelical organizations at the time, but there was also a very strong backlash at that same time. And so a lot of women who believed that they were invited into spaces that were characterized by equality and leadership opportunities found themselves just sort of slapped down by a handful of people in those organizations. And then often the organizations would kind of back away from their commitment to egalitarianism and make arguments about, just letting everybody believe what they believe, which is fine in theory, but in practice, it kind of left the women hanging out to dry. So I wrote about the crises that they experienced as a result of that, both in terms of their jobs, but for people who are outside these worlds, it's sometimes hard for them to understand how integrated a sense of calling is. It's not just your work, it's actually everything about who you understand yourself to be. So when the parachurch organization that women were working for left them out to dry, it led to a crisis at kind of every level of their personality and their social groups. Really devastating, actually. And then my more recent book is on Christian Reconstruction. And the basic argument of the book is that this is the most important movement that you've never heard of. And I kind of lay out the basic framework of Christian Reconstruction, because a lot of contemporary Christians talk about taking a biblical approach to law and society and life and all of those components. And to people who are uninitiated, that sounds, oh yeah, fine, that's nice. Yeah. Sermon on the Mount, okay. But they mean something really particular by it. And it is not incoherent. It's actually a very clearly articulated and thought out systematic approach. And so the book lays that out and explains it. And the second half of the book is all based in field research at different sites where Christian Reconstructionism has had an influence. Some of it is actually Christian Reconstructionist organizations explicitly, but others of it are, for example, there's a Christian school here in Florida that's been receiving tax money for a very long time. I was doing the research for this book in about 2009, and their whole structure was built around state tax money coming into their school for support. And they were explicitly founded on the work of Rushdoony and Rushdoony. I didn't even know it when I set up my interview with them but that he was their first graduation speaker. They had Christian Reconstructionist materials in their library. I mean, this is who they are. And they were teaching that with taxpayer funds in the state of Florida, and still are, as far as I know. So the chapters span the kind of theology, so there's a heady sort of scholastic theology
Yeah.
that's in the
Yeah.
first couple of chapters, and then there's the sort of on the ground interpretation of the theology that people like Gary North did, and then there is the fieldwork based section that explores this kind of out in the world.
Gotcha. So, how does one like Julie Ingersoll get herself into researching the intersection of religion and politics, and maybe especially so within Christian Reconstructionism and the radical right? How do you find yourself in this research area?
Well, my undergraduate degree was in political science. I was a student at Rutgers, and my interest really was in this intersection. It was, the rise of the religious right was what was happening. And I had a couple of political science professors who were interested in that. And I was working in Republican politics at the time. And so I kind of had a front row seat to some of the developments. And so that just really captured my attention early as a college student. And then I later married into a Christian Reconstructionist family. So that front row seat, I kept that for quite a while. And then I went on to graduate school so that I could shift my understanding and interpretation and contextualization of this movement and its significance into a more kind of scholarly way. So my training is in religious studies, which means that my master's is actually in history and my PhD is in the sociology of religion. So I'm interested in the intersection of social movements and how transformation happens.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you already said it. You're a part of you married into a group of Christian Reconstructionists. What was that like?
Well, I've been thinking about this question since you sent me questions in advance, and so I've been pondering this a little bit because as a trained religious studies scholar, we practice this thing called epoche, where we try to bracket our own stuff.
Yeah.
And so I have, well, this information is in the preface to my book. I don't hide it necessarily, but I don't normally like that's not the place from which I speak. I speak from my place as a scholar of religion. So it took a little bit of thinking a little bit about how
Yeah.
I talk about this. And I think that one of the things that just jumped out at me and caught my attention is how really different this far right, reformed, Calvinist, Dominionist kind of Christian world is now from then. Because I didn't like go in and embrace a sort of Doug Wilson version of Christianity. It was the rough edges of it that he and people like him just throw out there now for everybody, for all the world and God to see.
Yep.
Those weren't there. It was so, for example, when I got married, I kept my last name. I've always considered myself a feminist. And while that made for some awkward family moments, my in-laws didn't love it. There was a battle over whether or not there'd be obey in the marriage vows. But those were things that were counterbalanced by, for example, a sense that the notion of dominion was really about a calling to make a difference in the world and to do something important, and that it applied to both men and women. Although I saw that evolve over time to where it became much more. So let me be clear. It was always patriarchal. I'm explaining a little bit about how it was, as a 20-year-old, I don't think I saw it clearly, right? But you say, well, how could somebody not see that? If you're looking at Doug Wilson right now, you would say, how could somebody not see that? But I'm suggesting that it wasn't as in your face then. So, for example, no one in my circles opposed contraceptives. The Quiverful movement was just these were seeds of what became the Quiverful movement, but the Quiverful movement didn't exist yet. Now, my in-laws had a lot of kids, And they very clearly thought that that was part of the exercise of dominion, was to transform society in part by outnumbering
Yeah.
the non-Christians,
Yep.
by which they meant everybody that wasn't their kind of Christian.
Hmm.
But it just wasn't as in your face. Like the kinds of things that J.D. Vance is saying, they clearly thought that a woman's primary calling was to get married and raise a family.
Hmm.
No doubt about that. But they didn't say that that was the only valid thing that women could do. Um,
Hmm.
so it really had. So one of the things I'm interested in with how I trace social movements and change over time is how movements develop over time, and I'm persuaded that there's no clear line of demarcation between this thing that we call religion and other kinds of social movements. It's a social movement like any other one, and things can be religious or not religious, and they move between those categories depending on what somebody is trying to do. And it seems to me that what happened is that people with a patriarchal theology married up politically with people who had other reasons for supporting patriarchy. Some of them are quite secular in terms of how we use that language. And I'm thinking about people like Peter Thiel,
Hmm.
right? So you've got this amalgam of dominionist Christians, charismatic Christians, right-wing Catholics, tech bros, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, right? You've got an amalgamation of all of those groups. And what happened was that they took from each other the ideas and frameworks that were useful to them and adopted them. So the kind of the patriarchal stuff got much more extreme. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes
So it was
sense.
different.
Yeah, that makes
Short
sense.
answer
That's
is
yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, because it goes against the current narrative, at least modern Christian nationalism, that this has always been the case. We've always been fighting for this. We need to get back to where it was, but it's been growing from a seedling of Reconstruction that wasn't even quite the same as it is now, which leads me into this next question: is the modern manifestation, which is what people know of today, and I'm going to call it about 5 years old, or maybe since like post Trump. It's rooted in the rise of the Reconstruction movement, which you have profiled, you were part of in the late 20th century. So you've already described North and Rushdoony. If you can give a little bit of background on them, and if like who the major players were, and then the major ideas behind the Reconstruction movement, which is behind the current nationalist project.
okay. So clearly, Rufus John Rushdoony is the founder of Christian
Yeah.
Reconstruction. Clearly, Rufus John Rushdoony is the founder of Christian Reconstructionism, and clearly the most important figure. He started writing this stuff in the late 1950s,
Hmm.
and his critique of public education
Yep.
that really was actually I think, the linchpin. Okay, so the argument in my book that these are the most important version of Christianity that you've never heard of is that, unlike a lot of other theologians, Rushdoony instantiated his critique and his vision for society in a critique of public education and in a Christian school and then later Christian homeschool movement. And it was that instantiation into social institutions that led to his influence affecting broader aspects of the evangelical subculture and even the Christian subculture, broadly speaking, in the US, way outside Christian Reconstructionism, and frankly, outside circles where people have even ever heard of him. Like, so just as an example, so Rushdoony was key in theological argument and then making arguments in court settings that the education of children was a religious responsibility of parents, and that it was therefore protected by free exercise clause. And in doing so, courts across the country took a really strongly hands-off approach to what should happen in these Christian schools. They were independent. And then organizations like the Homeschool Legal Defense Association followed on Christian Reconstructionism to build a largely unregulated, unaccountable Christian homeschool movement across the country. that is, by the way, often now funded by tax dollars in the form of vouchers and various other kinds of things in some states, but potentially also nationally with the stuff that's in Project 2025.
Mm-hmm.
So this Christian Reconstructionist inflected version of Christian education just expanded across the country in the evangelical subculture. So anybody who sent their kids to Christian schools, or frankly, anybody who homeschools their kids these days, is influenced by Rushdoony, even if they don't understand it, because the places where they go for curriculum, the organizations that they can be a part of for social interaction and all kinds of other things have just drunk from this well of Christian Reconstructionism. It's so broadly influential that it becomes kind of like the water in which we swim or the air that we breathe. And so the origins of it aren't always noticed. But that said, Rushdoony was the pivotal figure, the person to articulate this. And I think that Gary North, who was his son-in-law, would have to be the second most important figure if you're trying to rank them in this way. And I think that that's because what North did, North was much more of a tactician than Rushdoony. Rushdoony was a theologian. And while his ideas took root, and we could talk about how that happened, because the coincidence, and I don't mean coincidence, actually. Okay, so the way in which Rushdoony's critique of public education coincided with desegregation was a historical accident that served Christian Reconstructionism really well. So, and since you're going to cut and paste all this anyway, let me just take that little detour, because I think
Please do it. Yeah.
So the dominant story about how evangelicalism came to be in its current religious right politicized form always revolved around the Roe versus Wade decision.
Mm-hmm.
But historians, especially Randy Balmer, have really successfully, I think, argued that it really did come down to race. Well, Randy Balmer and Anthea Butler also, her book, White Evangelical Racism, is really important. And when you start to see the way, okay, so you have a Christian movement that is largely based in the US South that is really unhappy about desegregation efforts.
Yep.
They don't necessarily want to say that. They will if you push them good, but they don't really want to. And along comes Rushdoony with this whole argument that, wait a minute, public education is unbiblical anyway. You shouldn't have your kids there. So they could just rush off and do their Christian thing that they, in their minds, separated from their motivation that had a whole lot to do with race. If desegregation hadn't been happening to motivate them to be unhappy with public schools, I'm not sure that Rushdoony's appeal that public education is unbiblical would have had the sway that it did. I think that moment was crucially important, and he happened to be there. But aside from the strategy of transforming education and critiquing education, Rushdoony worked in the area of ideas. Gary North, on the other hand, was a tactician. You know, one of his most, well, in my mind, there are actually a couple of works of his that are the most important. One is his book, Political Polytheism, where he basically argues that efforts at pluralism are effectively polytheistic, and that they cannot live in any kind of compromise in a civil society with a biblical world. That those two things are mutually exclusive. So political polytheism argues that, but his biblical blueprint series was a series of booklets almost, that were written for everyday Christians in their churches. And he took Christian Reconstructionism as an ideological or theological or philosophical system and played out what it was going to look like in all these different areas of life. So there's one on economics, and there's one on the family, and there's one on education, and there's one on international relations, and any aspect of what it would mean to be a government. He's got one of these little books on, and different people wrote them. But he was the editor of the series. And there is a chapter of my book which goes through this series of books. And And if you read it, you'll be shocked. If you read that Biblical Blueprint series chapter that I wrote that summarizes these blueprints, and then you read Project 2025, and you look at, for example, North says and I think he wrote the international. I don't want to get this wrong. In the Biblical Blueprint, let me start. Okay, in the Biblical Blueprint series, there's an argument made that the federal efforts at diplomacy and international relations and all of that should be focused entirely on business. So instead of having ambassadors, we should just have business people. And then you read Project 2025, and they want to completely dismantle all of the aspects of our federal bureaucracy that engage with diplomacy and treaty making and all that sort of stuff. And they want to replace them with business people. I'm not saying they got it from Gary North. I'm saying, again, that there's this subtle way that influence happens. And stuff kind of gets out there and it's in the air. And people pick it up and run with it because it matches up with some of the concerns that they're trying to articulate a defense for. And I think one of the reasons we've missed the significance of this movement is that we have an impoverished understanding of how ideas are spread, of how social groups work. We want to look for a one-to-one correspondence. You know, if we want to say that this movement influenced this social system, we want a book where there's footnotes, and that would be lovely, but it's often not there. And often what you have to do is listen for the echoes of the worldview playing themselves out in other places. So one of my favorite examples is if somebody's talking about government schools, they got that from Rushdoony. They don't know necessarily that they got it from Rushdoony, but public schools have always been called public schools until Rushdoony came along and tried to make an argument that they were unbiblical. And they're unbiblical because for Rushdoony, there's 3 different spheres of authority that God has ordained: the family, the church, and the civil government. And so they are unbiblical because they take a task that's assigned to families, raising children, and they assign it to an agency of the civil government. And so you can't understand these folks without understanding how those mechanisms work. But it's very subtle. It's very subtle. You're not going to find you're not, even when Rushdoony was writing, Rushdoony's work is filled with complaints that people like Francis Schaeffer, for example, took his ideas and ran with them without crediting him. I don't know that Schaeffer actually did do that. I'd have to look into that some more because they were kind of on a parallel track anyway, and they may have just come up with the same ideas at the same times apart from each other. But Rushdoony was very clear that there were people out there using his ideas without crediting him because he was an unpopular figure. He advocated stoning teenagers who were recalcitrant 3 times, right? Nobody wanted to be associated with that.
Yeah, and even the subtle verbal shift between public and government, I think a lot assume, even myself, up until you described this, had assumed government and public were coterminous with each other. They meant basically the same thing. But it does, represent a verbal shift where public assumes not polytheistic, but like a variable approach using a lot of different resources and different viewpoints for education versus, when he says government, he's using that third tier, the family, the church, and the government. He's using the third tier very intentionally over what he believes the family should be doing.
Exactly. And when you recognize that at the same time, these guys were all part of the John Birch Society, and they were infused with the kind of values of Southern Presbyterianism.
Yep.
So the whole idea of like the rise of anti-government movement was also fostered in their theological system. So on the one hand, you're fanning the flames of cynicism and hatred toward the government. On the other hand, you're making a shift where Americans' beloved public schools are no longer Americans' beloved public schools. They're suddenly part of the government that you're teaching people to hate. If you
Yeah.
go back to the 1950s, Americans thought very highly of public schools. In fact, I often talk about how we've even shifted our understanding of what counts as a sort of patriotic kind of employment. So now, if we want to talk about people's jobs who are patriots, we talk about the military, the police, the fire department. We don't talk about public schools. We don't talk about nurses and doctors. We don't talk about the policemen, right? Those all if you think about a sort of 1950s TV show, the mailman that walked
Hmm.
all around
True.
town and talked to all the people, helped knit the
He's a
community
sort of
together, and
hero
there
of
was
some
a
sort.
sense that
Yeah.
that was a patriotic job.
Yeah. True.
We don't have that anymore.
Huh.
And part of that is the rise of the fostering of this hostility toward the government.
Huh. Yeah. And something else you pointed out, which I've been reading Catherine Stewart's The Power Worshippers.
Mhm.
And
Good.
something else that she pointed out, and you also said too, was the rise of private schools in response to desegregation efforts, and how private schools, whether or not, like you said, whether or not they knew what they were doing, were, because of the government's effort to desegregate, they were like, no, we're gonna do our own thing in these private schools and not follow in the same tracks that they're trying to do, and we're going to segregate within these private schools, which was from what I can tell, the genesis of private schools wasn't so much like some of them were trying to teach Christian theology and have a Christian centered school, but it seemed like the effort to bring them about was because of the desegregation efforts versus just the Christian education.
It took me a long time to figure out how those all fit together for me, right?
Yeah.
And even actually, you'll find even in the book when I'm interviewing the folks at that Christian school um, in Florida that's funded by taxpayers, they're very explicit that what they're doing is not about race.
Hmm.
And there's another Christian school that I write about in the book that was my in-laws Christian school. And they were very proud of the fact that it was outside DC. And so they had folks from the World Bank. They were very proud of all of the students that they had from around the world of different races and different nationalities. And
Hmm.
so they were also very insistent that what they were doing was not about race. But I think it can be true that systemic racism and the after effects of desegregation built those movements while people were making their moves in their minds because of a theological commitment.
Yeah.
I don't think that those things get separated in the way that people
Mm.
make decisions about how they're. This is another example of how we, as people who spend our time in ideas and
Mm.
academics and historians, and we want a nice, clean,
Mm.
well-documented, two-dimensional explanation for something that is
Mm.
provable. When life is messy, people the way people's worldviews, Christian Reconstructionists are always upset about what they call intellectual schizophrenia, because they think that people need to adopt their system wholesale.
Hmm.
Otherwise it's inconsistent. It is inconsistent and people are inconsistent. It's just true. People, the way that we look at the world is much more of an assemblage and ad hoc kind of. Sociologists have used the term bricolage, right? There's lots of ways of talking about it, but we pick and choose from what seems to make sense out of the questions that we're asking, and we fit them together in ways that work, but that might not be rationally, inherently, philosophically, theologically coherent and consistent.
Hmm. Yeah. Yep.
Like Dominion, people who embrace Dominion theology and also are premillennialist, right? Okay.
Hmm.
Well, but do you like that's in fact, this is you were going back to your earlier question about who are the figures to pay attention to. And I mentioned that I think that Gary North was a tactician. Gary North in the 1980s started talking about how the charismatic movement was the Christian movement that was growing across the globe.
Hmm.
The frozen chosen, not so much.
Hmm.
Right? OPC, how many, right? All 12 people standing around with a Trinity hymnal.
Mhm.
It's a small, the OPC is small and it's always been small and it's
Yeah.
never going to capture the imagination of a nation, and like the way that the charismatics did in Latin America, right? But Gary North saw that happening, and he said, if we could get those folks to embrace Dominion theology, then Dominion theology would spread from Christianity. And you can find there are some of those two-dimensional pieces of evidence. He dedicated some books in the 1980s to some charismatic figures, the Mumfords in particular. And the Coalition on Revival brought together some Reformed folks and some charismatic folks. So there was this conversation back and forth going on between the charismatics and the Christian Reconstructionists. Lo and behold, all of a sudden, a branch of the charismatic movement comes up with its own dominion theology,
Yep. The Seven
right?
Mountain. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, see, that happened. And
Hmm.
that when I talk about how our today's religious right is an amalgamation of the Reformed Christians and the right-wing Catholics and the charismatics and all these other kinds of movements too, that's how that happened. Gary North did that. Not by himself, but he had the idea of doing this and he set out to do it. I'm sure he wasn't the only one. He's just the one that I have the references for because I can pull a couple books off the shelf and show you if you like. Yeah, but that was really important, and he was a tactician in the way that I don't think that that Rushdoony wasn't.
Hmm. Yep. Yep. So pushing further on the homeschooling, classical schooling movement. Um, and it's been gaining even more steam recently, far more steam recently. Because it was a bit maybe small is not the right word. Fringe maybe is not the right word. It just wasn't as big, I
Mhm.
guess, as it is. I mean, there's just it's all over the place now, or at least that's the impression given. And so many people assume all of the legislative focus of the right wing is on abortion or voting rights, immigration. So if you can push further into why it seems, at least to modern folk in 2024 and beyond, that their focus would be on schooling rather than on legislation. Although that's where like all the ire comes in is on legislation, but it
And there's a
seems like
lot.
it's on
If you
it
come to
seems like
Florida,
public schooling.
you'll see those two things working hand in hand.
Okay.
But I think what you put your finger on here probably is the most important question in this moment because too many people think that if Donald Trump loses the election in November, that things will be fine, that all this stuff will go away. And the reason that it won't is because unlike the left, if you want to call it that, but really, okay, so Nicole Wallace talks about the pro-democracy movement, from which she worked for the Bush administration and for so she's a kind of disaffected Republican, but it isn't the left, like whatever that means, the
Yeah.
left. It's basically all of America from center right left, right? Okay, but one of the problems that movement has in countering the dominionism of people like Rushdoony and Doug Wilson is that that movement, our movement, the mainstream American movement, thinks in terms of an election cycle or a current crisis.
Yeah.
Christian Reconstructionists think in terms of a millennium.
Yep. Yep. That's I was
They
about
are
to say they're
post-millennial, a
they're
thousand
very
years at
long-term thinkers.
least,
Yep.
maybe more.
Yep.
But even on a small scale, people like Doug Phillips, who headed up one of the biggest homeschool movements that was completely rooted in Christian Reconstructionism. It exists no more because of a scandal
Yeah. Vision
between
Forum you're
him and
talking
his,
about.
yes, Vision Forum, sold a package of materials to homeschooling families
Yep.
by which the family could build their own plan, a 200-year plan for a family dynasty.
Yep.
They sold this packet of materials. It comes in the mail. You sit down at the dining room table and you sit with your family and you plan out a 200-year strategy to have a family dynasty. And it's a
Yeah.
Christian Reconstructionist family dynasty.
They're
So
not
if
thinking
we're
every
going to think
4 year
in terms of
cycle.
the
Yeah.
next 86 days or however many, or if we're going to think in terms of an election cycle,
Yeah.
we're not going to be able to address the
Mm.
kinds of strategies that we're up against. And that's why education is underneath all of this. And it's why the changes to how people understand education that the Reconstructionists fought for all the way back in the 1960s. It's why that's when I say that the reason their influence outstripped their numbers was because of the way that they built a Christian education system. That's why it matters, right? That's why they're talking about it, because what? So 60s, 50 years on, 60 years on, we are seeing the implications of the transformation of public education that Rushdoony wrote about in The Messianic Character of American Education in like 1962. I might have the year wrong, but like early 1960s, Rushdoony wrote The Messianic Character of American Education, which was the fundamental critique of schooling that gives us all of the stuff that's going on in Florida right now with education, higher education, elementary, Moms for Liberty. We have an election here tomorrow. Moms for Liberty is on the ballot. The Moms for Some People's Liberty is on the ballot. And the way that those Moms for Liberty are understanding public education can be traced right back to the 1960s with Rushdoony. So Doug Wilson is a little late on the scene, to be honest.
Hmm.
So they started Christian schools all through the 70s and 80s. And that other Christian school that I wrote about that I mentioned, actually, they helped Christian schools start all across the country. And they had a particular model of what a Christian school would look like. And this predated the thing that is now called classical Christian education. But I happened to check back on their website when I was working on the book. So this was probably maybe 2010, something like that. And that's what they were calling what they were doing at that Christian Reconstructionist school in Northern Virginia. So the actual I'm not the shift in language about what one might call a Christian school, and this move to shape it in terms of what they're calling classical Christian education, that is not part of what I've worked on, and I don't know that I can tell you exactly when and how that happened. But I can tell you that what they're doing is not qualitatively different from what Rushdoony advocated in the early 60s.
Yeah, that is incredibly helpful describing, and I've heard that more recently, and this is probably post COVID. I've heard this more recently with the generational approach to theonomy, Christian Reconstructionism, or Christian nationalism, whatever it may be, where I'm starting to hear, and maybe more people are starting to hear more and more and more, like they don't care if Trump gets elected, they don't care if Harris gets elected, they just don't care. They're like, I am building society that my grandkids, that their grandkids will one day enjoy and flourish in. And that's where what you said, our extreme focus on every 4 year election cycle and wondering, is democracy going to fail? That's not even within their purview within the next few years. They're thinking 100 years, 200 years down the road, what kind of America are they building? So while
Mhm.
modern Americans are so myopically focused on the next 4 years, they're focused on generations to come.
They are. Yep. And we will never understand them until we make people, well, we'll never, you and I will never get the rest of the world to understand that. You and I will never get the rest of the world to understand them until we can get people to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's
That
why the
is,
schools are important.
yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's why they've been pushing
Schools are
so much for it.
everything.
Yep. That's why they've been pushing so much for this. Yeah, exactly.
But also, I think one of the little, so it is true what we've just said about 200 years, 1,000 years, long-term strategies. It's also true that they can be really smart in how they move things around, and it's possible that the shift toward identifying what they were trying to do with Christian schooling more explicitly with what they're calling classical Christian education, it's possible that that's a way to sanitize theonomy for people like Chris Rufo and Hillsdale College. They might not
Mm.
want to talk about theonomy, but they want to talk about the classics,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
And so when you dig underneath what Wilson is doing with Christian education, it's theonomy.
Oh, big time. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But he's framing it in a way that is palatable to people who don't want to talk about theonomy.
Yep. We will be making precisely that point with his theological project, his cultural project. He will use sanitized words to appeal to the masses when that is not at all what he means below the surface. But he's using sanitized words that appeal to many people. It's like, of course, I'd want to be part of this. Why wouldn't you want to be part of this? But what he really means is something entirely different or more expansive, or in other cases, more focused. But
Which
you'd
is
have to,
also interesting because I mean, he is a fascinating figure. He's not the focus of my work, but he's
yeah,
a fascinating figure because he will sanitize language in that way. And yet, if you ask me to come up with an example of somebody who's desanitized,
yeah,
crass,
yeah.
horror, like
That's also
so,
him.
so he
Yeah.
goes also the opposite direction tactically
Yep.
for specific reasons to appeal to specific kinds of people. And his
100%.
language is full of hateful rhetoric, particularly about women, right? He doesn't sanitize anything when it comes to talking about women. I mean, it's just downright nasty. Um,
Yeah.
so when you recognize how easily he does both of those things, you can kind of see how Machiavellian he is, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, that is again exactly what we call it. Yeah, it's he and anybody who speaks in a public setting will gear their rhetoric and language towards that particular context. But it's much
Of
more
course.
to have it's to have their message understood and known and digested by that particular context. But what Wilson does is both contextualizes, but then also projects and provokes and is subversive. And he knows what to say, he knows what not to say, and he knows what not to say. But then he'll repackage it in a way that gets laughs or
Mhm.
gets people shocked, and it tones the rhetoric down while he can still say exactly what he wants to say if he can make you laugh about it.
Yeah.
Um, so brings me to again, you already talked about it, Doug Wilson. He and I've listened to more of his recent stuff. He will somewhat distance himself from an explicit Reconstruction project, although what he was building in the 90s and early 2000s wouldn't have looked all that dissimilar from a
Right.
Reconstruction project.
Mhm.
But the stuff that he's doing recently would lead you to believe that he's not as interested in Reconstruction, but more so in integration in American society, but then changing it from the top down. Um, so how does he build off of Reconstruction work, even if he himself would say he's not a Christian Reconstructionist proper?
Well, there's a couple of things about that. And the first one is I think uh in fact I've been doing talks on this point lately because reporters will call me and they'll say, so is Mike Johnson a member of the NAR? Well, I think
No.
these are the wrong questions.
Yeah.
Because I if you get drawn into a back and forth on whether or not you can apply the label, you're not focusing on the important stuff, which is what their strategies are, what the long-term goals are, and what their time horizon is. You're not talking about those things. You're
Yeah.
back and forth on whether or not somebody can appropriately be labeled X, Y, or Z. And from what I've said already about how social movements work, I don't care
Hmm.
if you can call them that.
Yeah.
I don't, I'll call him that or I'll not call him that. And it makes no difference if that label, if you can affix that label to that person or if you cannot. What matters is that there's a long-term strategy to bring every aspect of American culture and then really the whole world under the lordship of Christ in this context called theonomy, with what's called the exercise of dominion and a specific articulation of what that means. So again, going back to the very beginnings of our conversation, If I just kind of walk down the street and talk to a neighbor and I tell them that somebody wants to have a biblical worldview, that sounds fine to most people because most
Hmm.
people think of oh, okay, well, Jesus loved the sinners and there's a Sermon on the Mount and there's good stuff in there, right? But it's the Bible isn't a first of all, it isn't a Bible, right? It's a collection of books for which we have actually no originals. Actually, we have fragments of the oldest parts that we have are fragments that aren't even originals, translated multiple times, chosen in a political process, right? The process of canonicity, like there were books that churches thought of as sacred texts that didn't make it into the canon. There's a bunch of gospels out there that the church said, nah, not so much. And they did this based on their apostolic teaching authority. Okay. But that collection of fragments of text has been read to mean all kinds of, that the slave owners and the slaves in the US South both worked their worldviews out of a biblical text, out of that same text. So depending on which parts you're looking at, right? This is how you get you get different versions of what a biblical worldview is. But Doug Wilson's understanding of what the world would look like if you apply biblical law to every part of society, which he wants to do,
Hmm.
his understanding of that is maybe in some places a little divergent, but Christian Reconstructionists disagreed over things
Yeah, they
themselves.
did. Yeah.
Um, Jim Jordan said all that stuff about the death penalty didn't mean that you should have the death penalty. It meant that was the most you could have.
Hmm.
Okay. So there is, I don't see a qualitative difference here. And I'm not interested in whether or not I can put the label on him. I'm interested in whether or not he's embarked on a project that I think is detrimental to democracy and detrimental to the basic rights of a whole lot of us.
Yeah. And that is what you're saying, the allusions and the parallels, the language that Wilson uses is
Mhm.
paralleled
Yeah.
with Reconstruction language because he even recently, is maybe 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, has talked about the Christian Nationalist Project, which may just be a relabel of Christian Reconstructionism or something. But he'll say this is a 500-year project. He'll that's which is exactly what you're saying. That has been the language all along, that this has been a long-term project. And even he says that the inner workings of their project right now is still in its like nascent form. It's still an infant. They're still working through it. They're still working through definitions and how this is going to work out. And it's because he's not worried about, like you said, he's not worried about November 4th or 5th or whenever the election is. He's not worried about 2028. He's not worried about 2032. He's thinking in the year of our Lord 2500, what is society going to look like? Which parallels language that we've seen before.
It does. Yeah. And when we started talking also, when you asked what it was like being part of that world, and I talked to you a little bit about how much things have changed, really. I think he's just a perfect example of that. And so there are ways in which he might be different from what Rushdoony said in 1967. No doubt there is.
Hmm.
But this is, again, a place where we misunderstand how social movements work. Nothing's frozen in time.
No.
All of this exists in a context. What do you think? You just fell out of a coconut tree?
Yep. Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Like it's going to change over time.
Yep.
And everything that he says, if it's not the same as what the Reconstructionists wrote in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, then it is a logical development out of that. And I'll give you a perfect example. So the way that Rushdoony and the Christian Reconstructionists talked about patriarchy was much softer than what people like Doug Wilson do. But it was never actually said out loud in my presence anyway. But there was this understanding of how family structures were the building block of society that lent itself to a hunch that maybe they certainly wouldn't have voted for the women's right to vote. Whether they wanted to undo it or not so clear. Nobody ever said it. And even when I was writing the book, there was the rise of something called the family integrated church movement.
Hmm.
Scott Brown, these folks were connected to Doug Phillips. And I don't actually know what the status of that movement is now. But they were building a network of churches, some of which would be totally on board with everything that they said, but others were just enough on board that they put them in their network. So you could go to their website if you moved across the country and you wanted to find a family integrated church, and you'd find these churches. But you know how things change over time. And they thought, oh, this is a way to bring people, to bring churches in to more of our way of thinking about things. And the family, and if you got down in the details of the family integrated church materials, you found that at least at church, in terms of ecclesiastical structures, in terms of church polity, the voting was done by men as
Hmm.
representatives of their families. Now, they
Mhm.
didn't necessarily slide on over to the suggestion that women shouldn't have the right to vote in civil society. Although Doug Phillips kind of said stuff like that on occasion, but not broadly, very secretive about it. But now you hear all kinds of people saying that. People in Doug Wilson's circles,
Yeah, very clear.
those Christian, those people who have embraced the notion of Christian nationalism and taken it on as you know, they will out not say that now.
Yep.
And I think that's partly because it's really a logical conclusion of the teachings early on. It's also partly because of what I was talking about earlier, how what we really have is an amalgamation of groups that come together with different commitments and concerns. And the kind of the whole tech bro world is deeply misogynistic. And while they don't have this kind of commitment to biblical law and theonomy, when they do have a commitment to misogyny and patriarchy. So the ways that those things mesh together isn't necessarily theologically coherent, but in practice on the ground, they make happy bedfellows.
Yeah.
It'll
So
be interesting to see what happens if they do get into power, because I think they will, like the I can't imagine them getting along for very long. It wasn't long ago that these, like Gary North would have thought that that like these folks were deeply anti-Catholic. And now there's a version of Catholicism that has made common cause with this version of Protestantism. But they don't necessarily see the world in the same ways.
no.
There's some deep cleavages there. They just don't show right now because they're working toward a common goal.
Hmm. Yeah. So talking about women in these circles, in both Reconstruction and in Christian nationalist circles, and your own involvement in these circles, and maybe the modern manifestation of these circles and logical outcome of these circles. How are women treated in these circles? How have they been treated? How are you seeing them treated? And um why do women want to be part of these circles? It seems like
Good
there's
question.
there's that patriarchal woman, which seems like a contradiction in terms. Um, what's in it for them?
Um, so I want to start with your last question first, because I think it's yeah, I think it's one that I have more answers to than some. I think you're talking to lots of people, and I think
Mm-hmm.
lots of people will describe what it's like to be a woman. But in terms of why women are part of these movements, there's a couple of authors that I think are worth taking a look at. One is Lynn Davidman, who did a sociological study of women. It's called her book is called Tradition in a Rootless World, and it's about women who
Hmm.
convert to Orthodox Judaism. And she herself was raised Orthodox and left. And so she writes at the beginning of her book about how it's just unfathomable to her that women would want to be part of this world, right? So this is why this is how she sets out on her research project. Like, why are they doing this? And what she found was that in her secular professional life, getting married and raising kids and doing all of that stuff was just not something that she and her friends paid attention to, cared about, wanted. It just wasn't there. And women who got to a point in their lives where that's what they wanted to do found support and networking and all kinds of resources for that thing that they wanted to do in the Orthodox community. And because they were new to the Orthodox community, they didn't carry with them the scars of having grown up in it the way that she did. So the cost of joining was diminished, and the value of joining was elevated because it met needs that they perceived to have in their lives in a day-to-day basis. So that's one answer. Another answer has to do deeply with race. And white women have always understood, and this is in some ways, I think, the more important answer and probably the more current answer. Because Davidman's book is old. But it helped me think about these things at a time when I was trying to work through them theoretically. But another really important answer to this question is really all wrapped up in race. And white women have always understood that their fortunes, or thought that their fortunes, were more closely tied to the white men in their lives than they were to any kind of solidarity with women of color. And so you have, women defending the rape of Black women as slaves in the South, or putting a blind eye to it, and so you're in a plantation family, you're the white wife of the patriarch, and he's raping the slaves, but you don't say or do anything about it because your sense of your own well-being is more closely tied to your relationship with him than it is to any sense of solidarity with those slaves as women. As we dig back, it's one of the reasons that the right wants us not to study race, right? Because when we start to look back at how the social movements that defended and supported white supremacy and slavery worked, we can see that one of the really most important mechanisms was dividing up white people who might have had some sense of solidarity or common cause among the Black population. You think slave cropping whites were poor. They had, in many ways, similar lives to the slaves, but they were separated, ideologically separated by people in power from identifying with the slaves because they were, given pats on the back for being white. And so they embraced that as a source of their own safety and self-worth. When in fact, if poor people all across the country were united, there'd be enough to overcome all of this stuff. It's only a small fraction of people who are driving this really destructive dominionism and theonomy and all of that. It's a small group. They're vastly outnumbered. If we embraced a longer term framework and recognized our interdependence and connection with each other, there'd be enough of us to overcome them. But so it's in their interest to keep us divided from each other. So white women in patriarchy find themselves empowered by being TikTok trad wives, and the cost to them is minimal, but the benefits outweigh the costs. So I think that for me, that's my explanation. That's my current explanation. I'm an academic. I'm a scholar. I'm always looking for better explanations. So that's where I am right now. I think that's a really important component of why women why women stay. Why do women stay? There, other answers also have to do with the way that this is all, and we talked about this at the very beginning of our conversation about how these movements end up being totalistic, and you talk about people deconstructing from evangelicalism or from whatever label you want to use for the form of Christianity that they are deconstructing from. The reason it took off, like when I did it, we didn't have a term, but the reason it took off as a term is because it really does describe the way you're not just saying, I no longer believe in Nicene Creed. You're not saying that. You are saying that maybe, but actually a lot of people aren't even saying that, right? What you're trying to do is unravel all the parts of it that have worked themselves into your sense of who you are, your sense of your purpose in the world, your sense of your relationship to other people, your responsibilities, your obligations, your sense of calling, right? All of that is all wrapped up in this. So that's another part of the answer, which is that it's really hard to leave for people, especially for people. There's a difference between people who converted to that world and people who were raised in it. Because the people who are raised in it don't have a self to be once they deconstruct all of this. So I think there's multiple reasons why women do this. And I think a sense of identity that has to be deconstructed in a way that's really hard to do is one reason. I think white women's implication in racism is another reason. And I think that the way that these conservative movements sometimes support life choices that women want to make is a third reason.
That's helpful. So, two concluding questions that are related to one another but separate. So, first, if you can speak to those who are interested in a Reconstructionist or a Christian nationalist circle, and most likely are, though they may think that they're doing this for entirely personal or selfish reasons, usually from the stuff that we've seen or I've seen, it's been reactionary to perceived cultural chaos. Can you speak to those who are interested in these movements from what you know as a scholar and what you know as somebody who is part of this yourself? Can you speak to those who are interested in joining one of these circles?
Don't do it. Yeah, I'm not exactly clear what you're asking here. Can you
Yeah, so it's
unpack a bit?
yeah, so this series is pitched to two groups: those who want to move to Moscow or want to move to one of the big Christian nationalist epicenters, or who are following political figures who espouse these ideas, and they want, like you said, they want to be part of a larger tribe. They maybe feel yeah, fluid, too individualistic, that they're not part of something big, and
Ah,
they see this big movement. They're like, I need to be part of this because there's nothing solid, there's nothing stable in my life.
okay. Um, so caveat that the women who might be listening aren't going to have the power to make decisions about whether this happens or not.
Yep.
And the men who are listening aren't going to listen to me.
Hmm.
Well, no, they
Yeah,
just
no,
erase
I know. Yep.
they erase women's voices.
Yep.
They will think that I have no right to speak, and so I mean they would engage you in a conversation about it, but they would not engage me in a
Yeah.
conversation about it. And I've watched this happen actually throughout my career when there's a handful of us who've been writing about this, and Rushdoony's the organization he founded gave another scholar complete access to their archives. They wouldn't reply to emails from me.
Hmm.
Same with Gary North, right? So the first answer is they're not going to listen to me. Theologically speaking, I think one of the breaks, like, I mean, my process of leaving was complex, like everyone's is.
Hmm.
But at one point, I realized that this whole system was built on this claim that if you don't have an absolute sovereign authority in a biblical God, then you have nothing and you have chaos. And I also didn't chaos didn't appeal to me. Still doesn't. You wouldn't know it by looking at my desk right now. But yeah, I need order in my life. And that was an appealing argument until I thought about it more and recognized that, first of all, that is no argument. It doesn't make it true. Even if you might prefer it, it doesn't make it true. But also, it may not be true that those are the only two options. Then it might be that there is no option that is as orderly and clear cut as the theonomists promise theirs to be, but theirs isn't that way either. This is also really messy. And life is messy, but there are, just thinking philosophically. So the theonomists argue that if you don't have an objective truth, everything you have is relative. right? That's the summation, that's the little, that's the thumbnail of the thing that you're asking, right? Well, that's not that's just not true. Um, we have all kinds of in between ways of having knowledge that isn't as solid as what the theonomists promise, but theirs isn't as solid as what they promise either. But it isn't just abject chaos either. We have I mean, language works. Language is a great illustration. So if you don't have hard and fast rules for language that never change, all you have is gibberish. Well, no, that's not the case. We have language changes all the time. And there's always that space where I don't know for sure that you're hearing my words in the same way that I'm meaning them. So there's always that gap where there's potentially messiness and chaos. But it's also true that it largely works most of the time. And one of the reasons it works is because I can say things in two or three different ways. So that if one way that I'm saying it is invoking ideas for you that isn't what I mean, if I say it in another way and then another way, you start to get a sense of if we're having a conversation in good faith, you can start to understand the point that I'm making, even if it's outside your own experience. That's how we can learn. But this is a movement that is so arrogant. They sometimes don't want to learn. They think they already have it all figured out. They think they know the mind of God. That's wild to me, especially given that their God, their sense of God, is this incomprehensible sovereign other, and yet they think they know the man. I just don't get that. Now, if you're a process theologian, I could see like you might think that you could know the mind of God, but how do they think they know the mind of God? There's no logic there.
Hmm.
I think you probably wanted a more practical answer, and
No,
I'm not
that's fine. No, I'm not
okay.
looking for any particular answer. Whatever answer you give. And then maybe pulling from your own experience, how did you get out? And then I know you can't do a 1-to-1 ratio for how other people can get out, but um, any advice for people who this series is now a rock stuck in their shoe that they can't not think about, and maybe it helps them along the way. But how did you get out, and how can that inform the way others who see this for what it is, how they might be able to get out too?
Well, first I'll say that I wasn't born into this, and so I think my path out was easier
Okay.
than it is for some.
Mm-hmm.
If you were raised here, you don't know who you are outside this world, and that how to build a whole new self that's the challenge I didn't have to contend with. I just had to go back to the person I was. That I thought I stayed that person through all of it. I lost some of it along the way, but the pieces were still there to go back and pick up. So I had an easier task. I think that it's probably helpful to recognize that the unpacking of it is both an intellectual process and a cultural process. So I did have to come to terms with what I thought were theological and philosophical truths that I studied, and I read other thinkers, and Hopkins, The History of Skepticism from Erasmus to Descartes was really great. um, so I started to see how the very certainty that they promised was a mechanism for undoing my sense that they were right, because they couldn't deliver the certainty that they promised. And the only way to respond to that was to make peace with a lack of certainty. And once I made peace with a lack of certainty, then the lack of certainty in the rest of the world wasn't as big a challenge for me. But there was also cultural unpacking. And people engage that in different ways. People who are non-conforming in terms of gender have a whole mess of unpacking to do that has to do with coming to see themselves as whole and okay as they are. but they also have within them the long-term cognitive dissonance, which is both difficult and painful to live with, but it's an open window to jump out of, right? That so if you have no cognitive dissonance, then you're in a closed room. Cognitive dissonance is are spots where you can get outside of this and see it from an outside perspective, and um that opens up other ways of looking at other parts of it. I think it, this is a very hard question. Yeah, I think I can only really speak to my own path.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
Now
not so much an advice giver.
the what?
I'm not much of an advice giver.
No, but I think even some personal experiences are good advice for those even listening. Now just an open-ended question. Any final thoughts, anything that you want to leave those listening with, both based off your research, off your experience, anything I didn't cover, or anything that
I think
you
we kind of
want to
captured those
particularly
along the
impress?
way.
Okay.
You gave me a lot of room to like pull in something that was only tangentially related in order to say it as it arose, so I didn't forget it. So, yeah, I don't think I have anything to add.